I think there are any number of challenges facing us in security, and particularly at that nexus between government and private security. Can you talk us through some of those challenges that you face in your work, please?
One of the biggest strategic challenges for the Australian government is to really shift the current culture of security in government to one that's more engaging and more positive. That has to it sort of several dimensions. To move away from thinking about security as an outcome in itself and thinking about how security is actually a business enabler. It's about the secure delivery of government business as an outcome. There's a need to shift away some of the thinking in government that security is the responsibility of the agency security advisor, that guy or girl over there, and shift that to security is really the responsibility of everyone in the organisation, and that's certainly linked to looking at security as a business enabler. Currently, some of our security arrangements are not very accessible or intuitive, and that's partly related to the compliance models that we've used in the past. And so we have to really make sure that our security arrangements are intuitive, they're accessible, and they're easy for people to understand and comply with because they can see a positive outcome. A really important aspect of those three dimensions is to move away from that compliance model to much more of a risk-based approach to security, where the sorts of arrangements that are put in place are proportionate to the risk. And that does involve a very large body of work, especially around the training and development of security professionals to upskill them in risk management, at least in the Australian government context.
Okay, so how do you go about implementing that on a practical level?
Attorney General's Department in my area, protective security policy, is actually doing a lot of work at the moment and over the next 12 months to build, I guess, what you would call a multifaceted program to shift that culture of security. That involves certainly looking at the leadership dimension, because it is a culture change process. So you do need to have very strong leadership across a whole range of organisations, not just in AGD as the lead agency for protective security, but across all the different agencies in government. You do need to have that buy-in by the leadership at the very senior levels in terms of secretaries. You also need, I think, to really focus on the communication piece as part of that message, to really explain to people why security is important. It's not about compliance, it's about actually the enabling process of delivering government business. The communications piece is complex because the Australian Public Service today is quite a diverse organisation reflecting society, and so over the last 20 years we do have a much greater diversity in the public service. We have a different set of values compared to, say, 20 years ago. We have a much more globally focused group of people working in the public service, and so that messaging and communication needs to be carefully managed for those different target markets. Also too, around the communications piece, we do need training and education, especially of the agency security advisors and managers, who also need to be responsible for the security outcomes for their particular areas. That's also about the professionalisation of the security industry in government. And that professionalisation is a very important component, because quite often a new staff member to government comes in, their first experience around a security issue might be a security manager or an ASA saying, no, they can't do something. We have to get away from that no mentality and the compliance model and much more engaging with staff and employees in the public service around what they can do and how they can do it, rather than the no sort of response. We do need then to be able to really look at the assurance and the results of that body of work. We need to have some systems, some simple systems set up where agencies report back about that performance assurance and how they're actually moving along with that culture change process. It is a culture change process that I think we need in government. It's one of the greatest challenges to build that positive culture of security across all agencies that range from the traditional security agencies in national security through policy agencies, industry agencies to service delivery agencies and cultural agencies. So it's a big challenge, but it's one that needs to be met.
Where government and the corporate world tend to intersect, or the business world tend to intersect, is in the area of critical infrastructure protection. I wonder, with the TISN, I know it's alive, it's got a heartbeat, but it doesn't seem like a very strong one at the moment. What's happening with the TISN?
TISN has been running now for over 10 years, well over 10 years. It is a relatively small group of organisations around critical infrastructure. So it's the owners and operators of critical infrastructure plus government coming together in a non-regulatory business government partnership approach. When folks talk about the TISN as a collective, it tends to slightly miss some really important differentiations about information sharing in the TISN context. So our sector groups all have different cultures. The water sector group has quite a different culture, an ability to share information and a willingness to share information in comparison to, say, the banking and finance or the communications sector group. And so we have to, when we think about the TISN, break that down a little bit and understand better the culture of each of those sector groups, understand the competition space that those organisations are working in or the collaborative space they're working in, and then respect that sort of economics and the business dimension, and then set up, in some cases, quite unique systems for sharing information in the context of that sector. For instance, the water sector, the folks in the water sector will share a huge amount of information with each other in a very collaborative way and have established mutual aid arrangements to help each other in times of crisis. In comparison, banking and finance sector, very competitive sector. We have great cooperation across the banking and finance organisations in the TISN, but understandably, they'll share information to a certain point, and at that point, after that, there'll be bilateral discussions between an organisation and government about some of the more sensitive pieces of information that they might not be entirely comfortable in sharing across the whole of that sector. And so we tailor our information sharing arrangements as much as possible to facilitate that in the context of the sector and the competition in the sector. So when we talk about the TISN, we do have to, if you like, understand those differentiations and the fact that different sectors are at different points in their resilience journey. Some sectors, like banking and finance, have done some fabulous work understanding their essential business functions and really looking at the vulnerabilities in those essential business functions, and then looking at the infrastructure that supports those essential business functions and trying to improve the resilience of that infrastructure. Other sectors aren't quite as advanced, and so we have to really move the sectors along in a journey at different points. So it is quite a complex and quite a different story for each of the different sectors.
I know from talking to people within AGs that they're quite committed to the TISN process. You've had your various, what you're calling business brand champions around it. I wonder though, do you feel you're getting enough from industry? Could they do more to make the TISN work better? Because
it's a two-way street, we work with each other a lot, and because the TISN's been established for such a long time, there are some really, really strong relationships built where we can sit down and talk to each other very openly about what's working and what's not working. So with the development of our most recent critical infrastructure resilience strategy that was launched by the Attorney General in May of this year, that new strategy seeks to add more value to the participation of the businesses in the TISM. So for example, instead of moving or instead of running a once a year very large cross-sector dependency activity, we're now running several smaller activities where there might be 2 or 3 sectors that come together to talk about a particular issue for them, and it might be around, say, liquid fuel supply and the impact on food in that particular group of sectors. And so we've broken that down to a much more, if you like, value-added process for those participants. Our first cross-sector dependency exercise was in Brisbane. That was around mobile capabilities and the way that the banking and finance and communications sector and also the energy sector respond to a particular crisis and deploy their mobile capabilities around an ATM system or a communication system to those communities that are being impacted. And that was a great, much smaller group of people coming together. There were about 50 odd people coming together, really sharing some detailed information about how best to deploy those capabilities. And of course we'll also then be able to produce the report and send that out to other sectors. So that's the sort of feedback and value adding that we're trying to build into participation in the TISM. It has been going for a long time, over 10 years, and a lot of the low-hanging fruit in the TISM context has been harvested, and so we are making sure that we try to add that value to participation in the areas that are slightly harder, if you like, to capture. In terms of the security industry, there's probably some great opportunities for the security industry broadly to look across other parts of the economy, other sectors, and take some learnings from those other sectors and apply those to the security industry and the security of organisations. One example could be the work in the critical infrastructure space around organisational resilience. So organisational resilience is about really building capacity in organisations to better manage and respond to unforeseen or unexpected risks and threats to an organisation, to those sorts of disruptions that wouldn't necessarily be on the risk register of an organisation. They wouldn't have been exercised, they wouldn't have been planned for. And so if organisations are able to build that greater resilience to unforeseen or unexpected risks and threats, that can help mitigate all sorts of different problems, ranging from, say, the lone wolf attack in terms of the latest challenges we have in terrorism, all the way through to some collateral damage because the building in close proximity, something's happened to that building, or because your supply chain, which is now stretched in terms of a global supply chain, has shattered somewhere along the line and unforeseen or unexpected, but now you're not going to get your essential product as an input to your business. So they're the sorts of I suppose, learnings that the security industry could harvest from other sectors and apply to the security and the resilience of their organisations.
Not only across sectors, but across the globe. I mean, there's work being done by CPNI, for example, in the UK, on communications as a security tool, yes, and how you can use communications to improve your security or indeed protect yourself. Yeah. Do you work closely with overseas agencies at all?
We do. We in undertaking a large body of work around, say, personnel security reforms, we've talked and received information from the CPNI folks in the UK, but also too from our Canadian colleagues and our US colleagues as well. And we have a strong working relationship with the New Zealand government, who's recently established a protective security regime which is quite similar to our protective security policy framework. So we have that Five Eyes community discussion quite often, both in protective security and in critical infrastructure. and there's a lot of cross-cultivation of ideas in that space.
Michael, you've spent a lot of time very helpfully talking about the relationship between business and government. And I could ask you a really easy question about government communicating with the community, but I'm not going to. What role do you see for business communicating to the community about security, and what more could business be doing in that kind of space?
The issue around community resilience is really important to the Australian government, and part of that is owners and operators of critical infrastructure, for instance, being able to continue their operations in the face of any hazard, whether it's a weather event or whether it's some kind of accident, because a community that continues to receive its critical infrastructure services, be it energy, water, telecommunications, through a crisis, through some kind of a disaster, is much more likely to be resilient than a community that loses those services very early, and then it takes some time for those services to be restored. Sometimes, and actually there's a growing body of discussion within the TISN around how best to do that, how best to engage with the community so that the community understands that the local service provider for energy or power or water has these arrangements in place with regard to, say, restoration, or has these arrangements in place to really improve the resilience of the community. By better managing that expectation, if people know that, say, in a disaster or a crisis they won't have power or they won't have water for 48 hours, then that really empowers those people to take their own action for that intervening period. In the absence of that sort of information, it's hard for a community to really know and understand what their responsibilities are in relation to the service provider or the critical infrastructure organisation. So that two-way communication is really important. It is about also to the community better understanding risk, and certainly that's a key issue for security across the Australian government as well, is that better understanding and better practice around risk and risk management.
In understanding risk, what we quite often find is it's the latest hot topic that gets all the attention and indeed a lot of the funding. How do we overcome, how do we ignore the chatter and actually bring it back to this is what's important?
Part of that is that professionalisation of the security industry in government, to be able to better communicate a story, a narrative to senior management in their organisations about the real risks versus what might be being talked about, say, in the media or in other places. So that's a real skill, is that ability to engage with senior leaders, to explain sometimes quite complex issues around security in straightforward and simple ways, and link that, importantly, to the outcome, the key outcome, which is the secure delivery of government business. There needs to be that outcomes statement that goes with the issue to say why this particular security issue is more important than that particular security issue. It is about consequence and about the impact on the organisation. If as a group of professionals we can get better at that and better at that narrative, it's more likely that the real risks will resonate with key decision makers in government rather than something that might be driven, with all due respect, by the media.
No, I found that one of the areas that we've had to do a lot more teaching in is in media literacy, just so that people in organisations can understand what is really happening in the media as opposed to what is apparently happening. And sometimes, a crisis doesn't have to be a drama. Sometimes we can deal with it. You've just got to cut the drama out.
There's a lot of focus on engaging the industry from a government perspective in understanding risk and preparing for a risk. But what about in terms of response, and particularly in terms of a major crisis? Where is government's role in communication at that point?
The community, including business, often look to government for that communications piece around what's happening, what's the situation awareness picture, what's the government's response to that. But that government response really much more needs to be integrated with the business response, especially, say, with regard to cyber and cyber security. The government alone or business alone can't really effectively manage something like, say, a significant cyber attack. And so there has to be increased dialogue and increased understanding of each other's roles in that sort of response to that particular crisis. And so we have organisations like the Australian Cybersecurity Centre being developed further to really better engage with business and the business community about not just what the threat is, but how to actually respond to that particular threat, say in the case of the cyberspace. It is a work in progress, that communication piece between business and government, and then understanding each other's roles more effectively is something that we have to work on constantly to get right. And we have a public which has very, very high expectations, especially of what government is going to do in response to a crisis. And we don't see those expectations being lowered at all. We actually see those expectations, public expectations, increasing. And so we need to be, if you like, constantly vigilant around how to better respond in terms of the communications piece in a crisis, and making sure that we also inform and advise our business partners exactly what we're doing and what we're about to say. We've come a long way over the last few years in that government dialogue and sharing that dialogue with business, and that's a good thing, but we need to keep doing more.